Hello, and my name is Doug Leasure, and welcome to another training session for Active Planner. And today we're going to look at the basics of calculations. And so what we're going to start with is one of the sample sheets that we created in our previous training sessions, so they should look familiar to you. And so with the calculation, the goal or the intent is that the calculation is used to retrieve external values. And so based on the design that we created previously, our goal would be that we would want to bring in balance information for our prior year actuals from our general ledger data. So we would want the system to automatically retrieve the balance for January of 2010, our prior year, and for February, etc. And then once those external values have been retrieved and brought into the plan sheet, then we will use some simple cell formulas to compute things like the sum of period 1 through 12, our year-to-date total, or perhaps use some simple cell formulas to compute our future year budget, 2011 budget, based on the prior year actuals. So that's the goal, and with Active Planner we can use the calculation engine to retrieve those external values. Now with the calculation engine, one of the things you need to understand that it is applied row by row. And if we look at our rows, our dimension value that we're using is the account number. And so the intent is that our calculation would retrieve external values for our account numbers. So values from our general ledger balances based on the account number. And the fact that it's applied row by row says that we do have the opportunity to use one calculation method on row 2 and a different calculation method on row 3. Certainly possible, but typically we'd use the same calculation method across all of the rows in our plan sheet, or at least in our particular section of the plan sheet that we're creating. So the next thing we need to think about in terms of the calculation is how it applies to the columns. So the calculations are applied to the column groups. So let's just take a quick refresher there from what we learned in an earlier training session. If we look at our groups, we can see that we have 6 groups here: current year actual, current year budget groups, and a prior year actual. If you remember when we designed the prior year actual, we designed it to be relatively -1, that is, has a year offset of -1. So our plan date, which ties to our sheet base date, is actually January of 2011. So our prior year actual group, because it has a year offset of -1, it is designed then to be January of 2010. Also, when we designed our groups, we said what kind of balance type, actual budget or statistical. And so we can see that as we designed our groups, they have a year and a period associated with them. And they also have a balance type. When we created we did the same thing then for our year-to-date totals for our current year actual budget as well as our prior year actual. Okay, now looking at the columns themselves, what we can see is that when we designed the plan sheet, we created 12 columns for the prior year actual, representing periods 1 through 12, connected to our prior year actual group. And if we look at the dates associated with these, we can see that each column represents a single period, so periods 1 through 12, and the range of dates, the from and through date, then would represent the beginning of and ending of each period. If we contrast that to our year-to-date prior actual group, we can see that the it's a single column, but that the range of dates go from January 1st, 2010 through December 31st. So this column represents the entire year, all 12 periods. So that's important for us to understand that as we apply the calculations to the groups. Okay, so let's take a look at actually creating the calculation. So what I'm going to do is just simply for row 2, our regular salaries, I'm going to click on the calculation button. And that'll bring up a little form that allows us to design the calculation methodology. Okay, so if we look at the list here, what we're seeing is a list of the groups that we've defined in the plan sheet. And for the actual group, current year actual, it probably would make sense for us to create a calculation here that would bring in the net change. And so what this is doing for us is it's saying that it's bringing in external data. The source is our general ledger data. And from the balance information, we want to bring in the net change. Net change as opposed to beginning balance or ending balance. And if we apply that, actually, I'm sorry, let's do the same thing for the prior year actual group. And so this says that we want to bring in external data, net change amounts from the general ledger source for the actual group, as well as for the prior actual group. Now we skipped over the budget group because you remember our goal would be that we would want to either manually enter the current year budget or the fiscal 2011 budget, either enter those values or to compute those values based on prior year actuals. So I don't want to use a calculation to bring in that data. I'm going to, on the plan sheet, enter or compute it there. And in a very similar way, for our year-to-date values, we currently have cell formulas in there to add up the 12 periods and compute the year-to-date total. Yes, it would be valid to use a source net change calculation to bring in that amount, but it actually is more efficient to use a cell formula. And the reason is just simply that for each of our prior year actual columns, Active Planner is going to go grab the external data, so it's going to make a trip to the source data and bring in the net change amounts in for period 1 and then period 2, period 3, etc. We could do the same thing for the year to date and bring in all 12 periods again, but why make another trip to the external data when I already have those 12 the values for each of the 12 periods already in the plan sheet? It's much more efficient than to just use a simple sum formula in the year-to-date column and let it just compute that on the plan sheet. So we'll set this to none. Okay. So having applied a calculation to row 1, the intent is that if I refresh these calculations, which is the term Active Planner uses to say, go get those external values, that it will bring in the balance then for this account number and do it for the prior, all 12 columns in the prior actual as well as the current year actual group. So the refreshing part is just a matter of selecting the range of cells that we want to refresh the calculations for that range. And I like to use the smart icon here to refresh the calculations. And we can see that it very quickly and easily brought in the net change balances for this account number. Now, just to take that concept a little bit further, I can select a range of cells and refresh the calculations. I can select a set of columns. I can select rows. I can select the entire plan sheet. And then when we refresh the calculations, it will refresh the calculations for any rows that have a calculation applied. And of course, those calculations are applied to specific groups. And so as we said, the intent was to bring in the historical actuals for 2010, then to use a cell formula to compute the year-to-date total, and then based on those historical values, then to compute our 2011 budget. Okay, let's take a closer look at the calculation itself and take a look at some of the options that we have here. Okay, so the prior actual group, as we said, the group itself is designed to represent fiscal year 2010. And so when we look down here in the bottom left-hand corner, the valuation source is set to current year. By default, it's set to current year. And that means current year based on the column group. So this isn't current year of the fiscal or the general ledger source, but current year based on the group. So since the prior actual group is 2010, current year represents 2010. In a similar way, our actual group, the actual current year actual, is defined as 2011. So current year means, for the actual group, means 2011 data. Okay, looking at the balance type, when we define the groups, we said their type was actual. So the group default means that we are using the actual group for both the column called, or the group called prior actual and the group called actual. Yes, we can change these items, but it just becomes a little bit confusing if we're expecting the group was defined as actual, but we're actually pulling budgets into here. It's possible that I could apply and gives you that flexibility, but it's just a little bit confusing. And in a similar way, we can define our prior actual to go grab values from 2009. Okay, but it just becomes confusing if the column titles say that this is January 2010, but our calculations pulled in data from January 2009. It just becomes very confusing. So the better way to do it is just to keep the defaults of current year and group default. And in a very similar way, we have the option to adjust the results of the calculation, either by increasing everything by some specified amount or by a specified percentage. But again, that becomes very, very confusing. So the best plan is to not use these options. And the last thing we need to talk about is just simply which columns are going to be affected by the calculation. We're applying the calculation to the prior year actual group, which has the periods 1 through 12 columns identified in it. But we do have the option to apply it to just simply the first column, prior actual 1, or to perhaps the remaining six columns, that is period 6 through 12. Or perhaps we want to apply it to just simply the individual quarters, period 1, 4, 7, and 10. So we have a lot of flexibility here. Again, it can be confusing if you're doing this. So the best bet is typically to apply it to all columns. But you will find that there are times when it makes sense to apply to just specific columns. Okay. The other thing we need to take a look at, once we've created a calculation, we can see that the calculation button is now bold. This is the indication that a calculation has been applied to this row. And now we can go on and create calculations for the remaining rows. But again, typically what we're doing is wanting to create a calculation and use that same calculation across all of the rows. And so what I like to do is to use the calculation copy. Now you can see that I'm not on the calculation itself, but because the calculation is designed as a single calculation applied to the entire row, it doesn't matter where I'm at on this row, when I copy the calculation, it knows to copy what's been defined in the calculation column. And therefore, I can select additional rows that I want to paste this calculation into those rows. And so I will use the smart icon for paste calculation. And you can see that the calculation we defined has now been pasted or applied to all these rows that we selected. And then if we want to refresh the calculations for all of these rows, we could very easily just select those rows and refresh the calculations. And very quickly it retrieves that external data for prior actual and for the current year actual as well. And then computes the budget, the 2011 budget, based on our prior year actuals. Now the concept we want to take a look at here real quick is if I manually enter values here, or perhaps even enter a calculation, a cell formula here, where we take this value divided by 12. Okay. If I have entered values or calculations here, and I refresh the calculation, okay, we'll see that the dialog box here says, refreshing calculations will replace values and remove formulas, meaning cell formulas, in the selected or indicated range. Do you wish to continue? So if I say yes, then it will run the calculation process to retrieve the values and to place them over top of my entered values and my cell formulas. So it has replaced what I had entered with the calculation, with what the calculation engine returned. So saying that a different way, when we are designing our plan sheets, okay, where we intend to use calculations, we would not enter cell formulas or amounts here. Okay, the intent is that these values will be created then from the calculation that is from the external data. And the last thing we need to take a look at is just removing the cell formulas or the calculation. So if we can actually open up the cell formula and set it to none and save it. But the better way, I think, is to use to select the range of rows that we would want to remove the calculation. Select it, and if we look at the calculation right-click menu, there's an option here for cut. So if we cut the calculations out of there, that's the quickest and easiest way then to delete or to remove the calculations. Okay, well that covers what I wanted to look at regarding the basics of calculation. So based on what we know so far, let's go ahead and move forward a little bit and look at calculation formulas. A lot of times we think of these in terms of the global formulas. And so let's take a look at the basics of formulas. So the first thing we want to take a look at would be our calculation. And we did talk about the net change as one of the types of calculations. Okay, but there is another one here called the amount. And this is a methodology of entering an amount and applying it to the columns in the group. And I'm just going to say, honestly, nobody uses the amount type of a calculation. So I'm going to recommend that you as well stay away from it. And instead, let's move on to what we want to cover, which would be the formulas. Okay, so the first thing we want to do is to take a look at creating or creating a formula. And so for their prior year actual group, the type of calculation we're going to select is formula. And the next thing it wants us to do is tell it which formula we would want to use to apply to the prior actual group. Now at this point, we have created absolutely no formulas in our plan for this company. So if we use the ellipse to look up, we'll find that there are no records, there are no formulas anywhere, no global formulas, no plan formulas, no sheet level formulas, just no formulas have been created. So what we want to do is look at the properties button here, which would allow us to create a new formula. And so when we create a formula, by default it starts out as a sheet formula. So what we want to do is we want to tell Active Planner that we're going to create a global formula. So I'm just clicking on the icon for global formula. And the idea of the global formula is that this formula is global to all plan sheets. It's available to use in any plan sheet. And 99% of the time we use global formulas, and we recommend that you always attempt or try to use a global formula. Now there are times when the formula we know by design is going to have to change from year to year, from fiscal year to fiscal year. It's going to have to change, or perhaps every time we copy the plan and make a new plan, we may have to alter or adjust the formula. In that case, we would want to make a plan formula. Then rarely, but very, very rarely, would we make a sheet formula. The sheet formula lives inside of the plan sheet, and in order to modify it, or to delete it, or to adjust it, I have to come back to the sheet and change it there. So it lives inside of the sheet, and it's just very hard to manage those sheet formulas because they live inside of each plan sheet that we create. So again, the best solution is to create a global formula. Okay, so the next thing is we want to create a formula key. And what we're going to do for starters is just do the same thing we did with the source net change. So we're going to grab values then from the general ledger, and it will be based on the accounts. And what we're doing is the source net change. So the intent is to just simply grab our net change from our general ledger source balance data. And when we look at the formula tab, okay, the first thing we'll look at is the type of formula that we're creating, and we're going to create a formula based on the account number. Okay, and choosing that gives us some options here. We can use the current year, or we can point to a different year. Again, I would recommend we always use the current year, and it's going to look to the current periods based on the column we're in. The next thing we see is the company, and by default we're looking at our current company, but it is possible to grab values then from other companies, where we just select them here from our company lookup. Balance type, we can grab the actual budget or statistical balance. Okay, and in a similar way for our valuation, we can grab the net change, beginning balance, ending balance. The last thing we need to think about is the account number. Okay, and so we're going to apply this calculation to row 2, which is the account number for our regular salaries. So yes, I could type in account 6,100, 800, etc. Okay, but that means if I do that, this particular formula only makes sense for row 2, and I would have to create a different formula than for row 3, row 4, etc. So the better thing we would typically want to do is to mask the account number. And so what this does within Active Planner is it tells it that we want it to grab then, since the segment 1 has question marks where it's masked, we would want to then, first of all, grab the value in our segment 1, the 6,000, and replace the question marks with 6,000. And then in a similar way, grab 100 for segment 2 and replace the question marks with 100 in segment 2, 800 in segment 3, and 00 in segment 4. do that in the from account and do that in the through account, so that, and do that before you process the calculation. And so that would then grab a range of accounts going from 6,100 through 6,100 a single count, matching what we've identified in the row. So it would replace the masking with the account numbers segment by segment. What that does is that allows us then to create a formula, a global formula, then that can be applied to row 2 as well as and as easily as it can to row 3, row 4, etc. The same formula makes sense now in this plan sheet as much as it would make sense then in our other plan sheets. It would work equally well in this plan just as it would in other plans, so a very generic formula. So let's go ahead and save this formula. And it gives us a dialog box saying, hey, it started out as a sheet formula. Would you like to save it as a global? And we'll say yes. So now we've saved it as a global formula. And when we exit the formula maintenance screen, it says, and would you like to apply this formula to the current group? And I'll say yes. And so you can see that prior actual group is set to a formula. And what formula is it set to? It's set to the formula called account SNC, which is a global formula. And so when we refresh the range, we can see that it's bringing in the same values. Not a surprise because that's how we designed it. So real quick, let's take a look at the active planner again. And now if we come to the folder for global formulas, we can see that we now have a global formula, and I can not only look at but maintain this formula for all plan sheets where we've used this formula. So it gives me an easy place to go look at and maintain this global formula. Okay. So now having created a basic formula, let's go ahead and take a look at making some changes to it, modifying it so we understand how the formula engine works. So the first thing I want to do is come back to our formula, and yes, I could manage this and maintain it over in the global formula list, but I can also manage and maintain it here within my plan sheet, because our formula that's applied here, the account source net change, we can actually, by looking at the properties of it, we can actually modify that global formula. So let's take a look at making some changes to this. Again, it is an account-based formula, and the actual account that we're using is the same account as defined on the row. So let's say that one of our goals here would be to modify this such that that we are actually bringing in values for not for a single location, which is segment 2, location 100, but let's say our desire, our goal is to actually bring in values for all locations within our department. What we can do is very easily modify the masking here such that we want segment 2 to go from 000 through 999. And so when we look at the masking here, Active Planner is going to take our segment 1 and replace it with 6,000. For segment 2, it's going to be hard-coded to represent all possible locations. For segment 3, it's going to replace the question marks with 800, and then segment 4 is going to be replaced with 00. So this would effectively bring in the salaries then for all departments, all locations within Department 800. And in a similar way, if our goal was to bring in the salaries for all departments, all locations, we can also use the masking to accomplish that, where we would go for the location 000 and department 000 through location 999 and department 999. So if we apply this to row 2, it's going to bring in the total salaries for all departments, all locations for account 6000. And if we apply it to row 3, we'll do the same thing for account number 6010. So I just wanted to show you the power of using the masking and how we can use that to our advantage then to bring in the values in for a range of departments, for all departments or all locations as we need to do that. So a lot of power and capability there. Now let's take a look at a slightly different goal here and see how we can use the formulas to create that. So let's say our goal here is to bring in the salaries for 6,000, account 6,000, and account 6020. So within Active Planner, we have the ability to define row 1 to bring in the values for 6,000, and that's actually already on our row. We have that account number. So using full masking here, it's going to bring in the account 6,000. And then we want to add a second row. That would be an account number. But this account is going to be 6020. And then 100, 800, 00 based on the fact that we're using masking there. So this would, if we apply it to row 1, it's going to take the 6,000 and add to it 6020, and then for the specific location department combination here. Now doing it this way would not make sense to use this calculation and apply it to row 3 and row 4, etc. It would only make sense in applying this to row 2, where we have the 6,000 account number. But at least you can see some of the capability and possibilities here, where we can actually retrieve the value as defined in row 1 and add to that the value that we pull back then in our second row of our account of our formula. So the formula engine allows us to create multiple rows where we can do simple math between the values returned in row 1, row 2, row 3, etc. Okay, let's take a slightly different look, and let's say that our goal is to bring back the account number. But in this case, we want to return actually the entire amount, the net change for the entire year, and then divide it by 12 so that in each period we are actually putting in an average for the entire year. So what we would want to do in row 1 is to modify our account definition here. I'm sorry, it's going to be a type of account. But what we want to change is the range of values that it's pulling back. Rather than pulling back the value for our individual periods, we want to modify it instead to say that we want to bring back period 1 through period 12. Okay, so for each period, period 1, 2, 3, etc., we would want to retrieve values for the entire year, periods 1 through 12. for whatever account number is entered on our row. And then on row 2, we want to take that total amount and we want to divide it by a constant, where that constant is the value 12. So again, what we've created is a formula that's going to take for each period we calculate this in. We're going to still bring back periods 1 through 12 as a total, so our annual amount, and then divide it by 12, therefore giving us an average. So since the method we're doing here, the purpose of the calculation has changed, let's go ahead and change our formula key and our description to reflect what we're doing here, which is computing the average of our account number. We'll save that and we will insert a new record so that it leaves the previous global formula there. And when we exit, we say, yes, we want to apply this formula. Okay, and now if we look at what we're doing in the formula, the results would be an average of the entire year, and that would apply that average then to every cell within the to every column within that group. Okay, and so what we would want to do is, now that we've defined the calculation, our current year actual being that change, but for our prior actual, we're applying a formula called the account average. And we would want to copy that calculation, apply it to every row in our section here. So we'll paste that calculation. And then if we refresh the entire plan sheet, refresh the calculations on the entire plan sheet, it will very quickly go through and compute then the average, the annual average, and apply that to the individual cells or columns in the group for prior actual. And when we calculate our sum for the 12 periods, it still reflects the correct annual amount for the prior actual group. In our budget, then, we're going to compute based on the average increased by whatever we typed in that increase column. And for our actuals, we're still going to bring in the individual period actuals. Okay, so that's what I wanted to cover in this training session, the basics of the calculation engine, also looking at the basic formulas and creating those. The next time, in the next session, we'll look at taking that further and looking at some of the formulas that we can use to grab values then from other plan sheets, which lends itself very easily to the idea of creating an assumption sheet or a plan level assumption where we can bring in perhaps percentages that are defined by the financial team to apply to the increase for all of our budgets, or perhaps doing it a specific amount then for regular salaries versus payroll tax versus workers' comp, but where those are stored in an assumption sheet that's entered and maintained by the financial team. All right, I look forward to working with you in the next session. Thank you.